It is September 25th, 2025, and the Wall Street Journal is now reporting that before Trump put out that statement claiming that he now believes Ukraine can get all of its territory back, as he described it, that he had a conversation with Keith Kellogg and Mike Waltz, two hawks on Russia, who have been very clear that they think that the U.S. needs to be putting much more pressure on Russia and that will work out well for the U.S. So is Trump just being Trump and trolling the world once again, or is he drinking the Kool-Aid, believing that there's some kind of a counteroffensive that Kiev and the EU are cooking up aimed at Russia? What does all of this mean for the current conflict? And what should we be keeping an eye on when it comes to this weekend's major elections happening in Moldova? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as I know that Trump put out quite the statement on Truth Social this week, claiming he now believes that Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form, he says. He now even has the New York Times suggesting that, quote, with his pivot on Ukraine, Trump may be washing his hands of the war. All right. How do you view Trump's statement? Is there a chance that he is really trying to distance himself in the U.S. from this war? And is that going to have any impact, do you think, on the obvious U.S. involvement?
Okay, so first of all, my first take from this as an analyst is to ignore it as much as possible, right? I have reached the point where Trump saying one thing one day, one thing another day. One day Zelensky's a dictator. The other day, did I say that? I don't know. I'm walking away from this. I'm never coming back. And then the next day, I'm back. I'm far more concerned about what the U.S. is doing than what Trump is saying on social media, because a big part of that is a strategy, mostly a domestic political strategy, but a strategy of distraction, and to some degree, I'm sure, simply emotional outbursts from Trump. So, evidently, the New York Post, at least, is telling us that he talked to Kellogg and Zelensky just before this, and Zelensky, according to the Wall Street Journal, sold him on some kind of idea of a Ukrainian counteroffensive upcoming that they need U.S. intelligence support for. New York Post also tells us that this is some type of strategy to get under Putin's skin, like that's possible. I mean, the reaction from the Kremlin has just been as cold as ice to this, right? I mean, even Medvedev was relatively quiet, and he's like, yeah, Trump says one thing one day, another thing the other day, and I think that's the best way to view this. Trump has said multiple times before that the U.S. is about to walk. I'm going to walk away, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, if only, right? Not going to happen. You don't have the ability to do so, even if you wanted to. I do not believe that the U.S. is trying to separate itself from this conflict, right? Is the U.S. stopping the supply of intelligence, C4ISR, satellite data to the Kiev regime? No. Are they withdrawing the generals that the New York Times says are running this conflict by remote from Wiesbaden military base in Germany? No. Are they stopping the flow of arms? No. By all accounts, Trump is now going to be providing more arms, $1 billion worth of them a month, supposedly, although I'm very curious to see what those arms actually are, that he has to send, because they certainly don't have any air defense, and that's what the Kiev regime really needs. The U.S. doesn't have any air defense either. So, and we've received word that the U.S. is not even providing Patriot systems or Patriot interceptors to Europe right? Because they know that they would immediately go to Ukraine anyway. So that's how short they are on this. That's the U.S. Achilles heel. But they are going to provide arms. They just now the Europeans supposedly are going to be paying for them, which just means they'll take out more debt, or they will literally steal Russia's money that they've frozen and use those to pay for it, because otherwise they don't have the money. But nothing is really changing, right? Trump has all of this rhetoric, but there's been no shift in U.S. policy. So I do think Trump is trying to distance himself, not to distance the U.S. from the conflict, but to distance himself politically in the United States for responsibility for this conflict. These are not the same things, right? We have not seen any sign that the U.S. is doing any less in terms of this conflict. Trump hasn't launched any new big sanctions. He still has some small ones against Russia, right? That's true. But is that because Trump doesn't want to, or because there's a recognition that there's no sanctions left to apply to Russia? And they can't put tariff sanctions on China because they just lost a trade war with China. They went after India just because they were weak and they could, but that's not changing India's policy either. So Trump, I think, is always far too focused. He has a very political mind, right? He has his mind on domestic politics. During his UN General Assembly speech, 46% of his speech was him talking about himself in domestic political terms, right? 46%, right, of the 53 minutes. So, that is Trump being Trump, right? And that's why I don't think we should ultimately pay too much attention to this. We should pay more attention to what the U.S. is doing, and because that's what Russia is doing, right? Yes, Russia is responding to this cool as ice. They're still being diplomatic. They're still being polite. Let's be frank. The Kremlin is still blowing smoke up Trump's ass rather than responding to him in a way that emotionally I would prefer to see them responding to Trump and the United States. But they're playing a game. But they understand they're playing a game and they're not betting on it. They're continuing on the battlefield, right? As there's no hesitation, there's no interruption. And in fact, in many ways, you could say Russia is continually building up, continually escalating the next level, more troops, everything. The contact line is getting longer. The attrition is grinding faster. It's all continuing. Nothing of that is changing, no matter what kind of stunt Trump pulls in his speech at the UN General Assembly, then blaming the UN General Assembly for sabotaging it because his escalator didn't work or his elevator got confused, and his mic, his teleprompter didn't work, and that sort of thing. Ultimately, with Trump, it's always, for me, this scene from Gladiator, the original Gladiator, right? Where Maximus is on the floor of one of the Colosseum, one of the gladiator rings, and he's just defeated his opponent, I guess, unexpectedly. And he turns to the crowd and he says, "Are you not entertained? Is that not why you are here? Is that not why you elected Trump? Are you not entertained?" And that is, I think it's more important to focus on actual U.S. policy changes, of which I see none. And Western media has quietly noted that despite the change in rhetoric, one way, the other way, right? With this latest about face, suddenly Ukraine is going to be marching on Moscow and everything. Nothing in U.S. policy has changed. Not in the pro-Russian direction, not in the pro-Ukrainian direction. Everything is still going. So my best advice with this social media post, until there's an actually policy change, I mean, ignore it as best as you can. It's hard to do because it's kind of in your face, right? And there's a media desire to talk about it, but you're better off in analysis terms, I think, to just leave it on the floor and see where things settle policy wise in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think that that's a good way to sum it up and just don't get on the roller coaster, right? Because that's what it is with Trump. It's up one day, it's down the next, and you're just trying to figure out what in the world or where in the world he stands, which I guess if you don't like his what he's saying right now, just wait a few hours because he just might change.
Ultimately, it's not about what Trump does, it's what the institutions of power, the deep state, the blob, the bipartisan Congress. Trump is just a figurehead. Ultimately, he has very limited power to change things, and he's just very good at making a lot of noise.
Yeah, that's a good way to sum it up. Now, I'm also curious too, because I know one thing you brought up there was this Wall Street Journal report that right before Trump's True Social statement, he had a conversation with his special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, and Mike Waltz, who has also advocated for putting more pressure on Russia to force them to the negotiating table. And the report says that they told Trump about plans for a Ukrainian counteroffensive that requires US intelligence. All right, so when we look at what Russia has been saying, it's that essentially Ukraine is not able to get together the means for a possible counteroffensive. So, how do you see the possibility of NATO trying to drum up something, especially at this point? Could we see them try to, launch some version of like we saw with the Kursk incursion last year? Had they finally learned their lesson that maybe that wasn't the best idea, or could they be, throwing a similar sort of PR spectacle at the wall just to try to make headlines in the West?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly possible. I mean, it won't be a real counteroffensive, right? Meant to change the course of the conflict. It will be something like another Kursk that is primarily narrative and political driven. That ultimately, of course, is just going to hasten the degrading of the Kiev regime military, but might net them some headlines, some success, right? Remember, the most important thing we were told during the Kursk Fool's Crusade in the beginning was Putin is embarrassed by the Kiev regimes. Well, a year later, how's that embarrassment going, right? I mean, who has egg on their face at the end of the day, right? I mean, you can generate some headlines and whatever. Taking a look at where the Kiev regime has some forces built up that might give an indication. There's been a suggestion that Belgorod might be a target to the east of Kursk, right? The region directly to the east. The Kiev regime has in previous years launched several raids using Russian neo-Nazis that fight for the Kiev regime, literal Russian neo-Nazis, the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Russian Democratic Forces. These are literal neo-Nazis. They have made raids into the Belgorod region. And there's some buildup of forces there. What would the Kiev regime achieve strategically by doing this? Nothing, right? Again, part of their logic has always been, if we upset the Russian people, they'll overthrow Putin and then the war will end. I mean, that's the kind of ridiculous thinking that sometimes goes into these things. The other one, of course, is drumming up more money and arms from Europe by showing they're still in the fight and fighting back and something of the sort. Now, for a real offensive, I mean, it's too late in the season to launch a serious new offensive in a major direction or to reverse anything significantly along the contact line. I don't see that. But some narrative headline grabbing stunt penetrating the border at Belgorod or something like that. It's possible. It will be just another waste of their own forces that would have been better spent in defense than on some type of narrative political driven Hail Mary play. Right. There's enough Kiev regime military commanders at all levels who have come out and have been quite open now condemning Zelensky for wasting so much during the Kursk, but he himself will never, back down from how important that was and how wonderful that crusade, that failed Fool's Crusade was. So, I mean, it's entirely possible that he may be intending to launch something like that again, and Belgorod is a target. Another target for possible escalation is Moldova. Moldova is very politically unstable right now. They have the pro-Russian separatist region, Transnistria. There are parliamentary elections in Moldova this weekend where the pro-Western president Maya Sandu is, it's possible she could lose these parliamentary elections, but whoever wins them, the other side won't accept the results. There'll be protests in the street. It's primed for the Kiev regime to send forces in. Zelensky just put forward a bill to the Rada in the last week, allowing Ukraine to send military forces abroad, i.e., into Moldova. There's the SVR, the Russian intelligence, has been warning that NATO is planning on occupying Moldova. There's other talk that they already have stationed, that the UK and France already have troops for that purpose in Odessa, just across the border in Ukraine. So I'm going to be watching for a possible escalation this weekend. What the election happens, and then the week, shall we say, after, and what happens politically and on the streets of Chisinau and Moldova. I would be very surprised if this conflict ends at some point in the future without at some point Moldova being drawn into this conflict, because NATO is pushing to drag Moldova into NATO, just like they are with Ukraine, right? They're positioning Moldova as the next, and there's a lot of reasons. In Transnistria, for instance, there is very possibly the largest arms depot in the world, where a lot of old Soviet weapons that the Kiev regime could make very good use of are located in Transnistria there if they were able to get a hold of it. One has to presume that Russia has it primed to blow. But Russia has 1,200 peacekeepers in Transnistria, not a large force. And because it is landlocked and on the other side of Ukraine, Russia has no easy way to reinforce those troops. They have a hard time just keeping them supplied, right? Mostly smuggling, to be perfectly honest. And if the Kiev regime or NATO moves troops in there, there's very little Russia can do. And an airlift across Ukrainian territory would be very dangerous. And then even getting troops there, then keeping them logistically supplied, it's just primed to turn it into a headline and game changing. It would expand the conflict beyond just Ukraine definitively, and it would then make it much easier to spark direct NATO Russia conflict, which is quite obviously what a lot of the European leaders are trying their best for at this point.
Yeah, it really seems like that. And that's good to know and interesting to kind of see the ways in which, because I know that, the US is not just looking at Ukraine, they're also looking at all these other surrounding countries and going, okay, how do we make sure that there is as much NATO influence as possible? And you do see these reports where, I mean, we've seen it this week and the week before. NATO is on a roll accusing Russia of violating its airspace with drones in Poland, they say, aircraft in Romania and Estonia, all allegations that Russia has not only strongly denied, but also said, hey, we would love to see the evidence you claim that you have. Now you have NATO putting out this statement, calling this a pattern of increasingly irresponsible behavior, in a warning that they issued this week in which they threatened to use all necessary military and non-military tools to, I love how they say defend themselves, as if that is what they really need to focus on
from those fiberglass and styrofoam decoy drones with duct tape that magically land on chicken coops in Poland. All right, this is absurd provocations and false flag by the Europeans and the Kiev regime with the intent of trying to drag the U.S. further back into the conflict, right? They don't want to be paying for the whole thing, and they don't believe that Trump is escalating the way he should be. That this is, what all of this noise is. There's no reality to any of it as far as I can see. I personally, that the image of that duct taped drone having landed perfectly on a chicken coop in Poland. I mean, that just, the Western mainstream media is absolutely incapable of asking critical questions about that. Then, they're incapable of asking critical questions about anything. It's just absurd. This is literally the boy who cried wolf, except the boy who cried wolf is trying to take selfies with an AI generated wolf in the background there somewhere, right? Is what it is. I don't take any of this noise seriously. This was intended to get a reaction from Trump. It did not. What worries me is that the next false flags and provocations will have to be bigger, will have to be more serious, maybe even some fatalities. Don't think they're going to give up just because they didn't get the reaction they wanted this time, right? Trump changed his rhetoric, but he didn't change policy one way or the other. They will be seeking to escalate things, to create some type of provocation, blaming on Russia. And if they didn't get the reaction they wanted from duct taped together Russian decoy drones that they picked off the ground in Ukraine, and placed on a chicken coop in Poland, well, what will they do next? And try to blame on Russia. Maybe some bodies next time, right? If that's what's necessary. I don't believe they will stop in that process.
Yeah, and that's my biggest concern watching this too, exactly as you're noting there, that each time it's got to escalate a little bit more. And yeah, sure, Trump is sitting there saying, oh, yeah, I have no problem with them shooting down Russian aircraft. But that is a major concern, that you could have one of these little NATO countries in the region that decides that they're going to pop off and do something. And of course, they claim Russia violated our airspace, where, maybe it's something that happens in Ukraine. But when it comes to the threat of a false flag, how do you see it in terms of, especially over the last 3.5 years, are we at kind of that highest point of danger where something could happen? And it doesn't matter what Russia says. What matters is how much the NATO alliance sees that they can get the public to hop on board with believing, previously it was, oh yeah, Russia bombed their own pipeline. Now it could be, oh yes, Russia targeted this group of civilians, or some other version of that they decide to claim and put out there.
Yeah, I don't think we're at the peak yet. I mean, we'll see the peak. Well, we'll see several peaks yet, right? Where when Russia finally takes all of the Donbass sometime, probably by next summer, when they take the last defensive line, when they take all of Donbass, then when they start moving on cities like Kharkov and Zaporozhye, and then Kiev, right? I mean, those, you'll keep seeing new peaks, that there will be attempts by those who want conflict between NATO and Russia to provoke that conflict. And there will be ever increasing hysteria. We have not reached the peak yet. We may have reached new heights, but there's higher peaks yet to come. I'm unfortunately almost sure. And I don't think that there is anything that these people involved will stop at in order to get the response that they want. And let's frank it, there's a lot of people, not only in the political elite, but in the intelligence, the military elite, in various NATO countries, including in the United States, including some people in the Trump administration, that really want war with Russia, that think that they can fight a small conventional war with Russia, and somehow it won't go nuclear, and Kellogg going off, oh, we can kick Russia's ass, and all of this type of thing. Russia is a paper tiger. Well, if Russia's such a paper tiger, then why hasn't all of NATO forces put together stopped them in the last 3.5 years?
Yeah, that's the thing with his statement, I'm looking at it and I'm like, yeah, it sounds like it was written by Keith Kellogg. But to sit there and say, and this, I guess this goes back to the way that the US has framed this entire conflict. They have framed it as if Russia is in it for the territory. And you see that in Trump's statement, right? Where he's like, oh, what have they accomplished in the last 3.5 years? And it's like the degrading of Kiev's forces, right? As you've been
Not just
saying,
Kiev's forces, they've
right? NATO,
demilitarized most of NATO, right?
yeah.
That's why NATO doesn't have Patriots, interceptors, and a whole host of other missiles and lots of military equipment. They've demilitarized much of NATO as a result of this.
Yeah, and instead the US acts like, "Oh, Russia's just worried about land." It's like, "No, Russia is not in this conflict like the US would be in this conflict if we decided that we were going to go in and, conquer Ukraine, and the US would have gone straight to Kiev, taken out Zelensky on day 1 or attempted to, and then made a mess of it that way." But when it comes to Russia's overall goals here, that is something I wanted to bring up because obviously, as we've been talking about, NATO is in this position where they're trying to make it clear that we are going to be everywhere, right? Our influence is going to be everywhere in the region. You're never going to get rid of it. Well, Russia is over here in this position of trying to do away with that influence on their doorstep. So, how do you see kind of the current state of Russia's goals when it comes to the war in Ukraine and how far they are willing to go and kind of what their end goals look like when it comes to dealing with NATO here?
Yeah, officially, Russia's position is still the same, right? Which is they regard the basis of a settlement to be the Istanbul talks back from 2022, basically Istanbul plus Kherson and Zaporozhye, right? Which they've laid claim to since, along with Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, right? That's Russia. That deal is still kind of officially still on the table, but at the same time, Russian officials and the Russian military, are giving all signs of indication of where they're actually going. And there's indications in the last week that they're already preparing to move on Kharkov City in the Kharkov region. Russian forces this week began seriously using FAB glide bombs at Kiev regime's military supply and command and control points in Zaporozhye city. Russia's going further. They've already indicated this. I whatever the rhetoric may say, I think there is enough people within the Kremlin that have reached the conclusion that this will only be settled on the battlefield and that NATO is giving us no choice but to occupy all of Ukraine. They're not going to, at any point, sign any papers and give up anything less than that. They'll fight from Kiev, they'll fight from Lvov, and then I believe they'll fight a guerrilla war out of Poland and Romania. That's not what the Kremlin wants. But at the end of the day, I don't think they're going to be left with any other option to end this conflict. And I think there's enough people within the Kremlin that understand that now, whatever officially the political rhetoric may be.
Yeah, that's good to keep in mind, especially because, hey, I mean, I feel like they've given the US and the Trump administration plenty of chances. They've said, hey, we're happy to have talks, like you were noting. Here's this deal on the table. Here are their demands. I mean, how many
Big
hours?
neon sign that says exit ramp right here.
Yeah, how many hours has Vladimir Putin spent with Steve Witkoff going over this time and time again? And yet the US is still, well, they're going to be the US and NATO's still going to be NATO. And I know that there is a lot at stake here all around as we continue to watch this conflict move forward, continue to watch or maybe not watch all that Trump is tweeting and putting out there. But I always appreciate you taking the time to join me to break down all of the latest here. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.